Hello and welcome to Sam-Splaining Science. I'm Sam. I'm your host. I'll be Sam-Splaining the science. And today we're talking about IUDs. This is what happens when you don't go to samsplainingsci.com/ask to ask a question and suggest a topic for a future episode. It's that I'm left to my own devices. And I just talk about whatever the hell I want to talk about, which today is IUDs. But before we get into that, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I hope your summer is off to a great start, and that you had a good 4th of July weekend. Mine was hot, dude. There's a heat wave in New York. 0 out of 10. Don't recommend. Remember the episode where I talked about ice and I was talking about how I don't like the snow and how I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of summer either. You know what it is? I just don't like extremes. I'm like a middle of the pack kind of gal. So like a winter, too cold. Summer, too hot. Spring, I'll hang out in spring for sure. Fall, yes, absolutely. The extremes, not a fan. Not a fan. But I really can't complain, honestly. The air conditioner was my best friend. And my many ceiling fans really came through. And luckily the weather has broken since then. And it's now a very adaptable 85. Not so bad. Much better than a 101. I'll tell you that. So things are looking up here. But I hope you're doing well. I hope your summer's off to a good start. As I mentioned, today we're talking about IUDs, or intrauterine devices. I chose this topic because, full disclosure, maybe TMI. If I know you in real life, close your ears. I got an IUD a few months ago, and in getting an IUD and deciding which birth control method to use, I said, you know what? I'm going to do some research. I'm going to do some reading and learn about all the different types. So I did. And that's why today's topic is IUDs, is because I have all this information in my brain. So I might as well share it. And if nobody else wants to learn anything, then this is what I'm going to talk about. But friendly reminder that if you go to samsplainingsci.com/ask, you can ask a question and it'll be a topic of a future episode. And you can also ask it anonymously. So if you don't want to shout out, just don't leave your name, and that's fine. But you can still ask a question, and it'll still get Sam-splained to you in a future episode. So throwing that out there one more time. Thanks. Appreciate you. And with that, let's get into the episode. Hello. As always on Sam-Splaining Science, we start by asking questions, because asking questions is the best way to learn. It's a way to identify what you don't know. So let's start with the questions. The first question, what is an IUD? Second question, how does it work? And then the third question, arguably the most important question, how well does it work? That's it. That's the $1 million question right there. But that's what we're going to cover in today's episode. As always, the sources for these questions, or the responses to these questions, I should say, are linked in the episode description. Primarily, today's source was a textbook chapter from a textbook called Optimizing IUD Delivery for Adolescents and Young Adults. It was published by Springer and edited by Mandy Coles, who is a doctor at Boston University, and Aisha Mays, who's a doctor at UC Berkeley and UCSF. So that's where I got most of this information from. Some figures have their own citations. I don't know if my microphone picked up the motorcycle outside, but my windows are open because I mentioned it's 86 degrees, right? So, and I can't have my AC on while I record because it's very loud. So a little bit of breeze is going to help me from getting too shiny with sweat. Okay, let's move on. Question 1, what is an IUD? An IUD is an intrauterine device. IUD, intrauterine device. It's basically like a T-shaped device that's placed directly into the uterus. The process is, how do I put this nicely? The process of placing an IUD is kind of like if you sat on a crate of dynamite. Just kidding. That was a direct quote actually from Gilmore Girls. But it's not a pleasant experience at all. What they do is for people who have uteruses, they'll put a speculum into the vagina to open it, and then they'll insert what's called a tenaculum, which is basically like a very long, like forceps, kind of like one of those like salad tosser things almost, but it has claws on the end, like metal claws. And they take that tenaculum and they cinch it to the base of your cervix so that your cervix stays in place. And then they have to measure your cervix. And then they have to place the IUD through your cervix directly into your uterus. And then they pull everything out. The whole process, at least in my experience, took maybe, I'm going to say maximum 4 minutes, which doesn't seem so long, except every second of those 4 minutes was unbearable pain. And like, I have like a pretty decent pain tolerance, and I practice meditation. So I was doing my deep breathing and I was trying to focus my mind on anything else besides the pain. But it was still there. It was still there. But you know what? After those 4 minutes, you're done and you're free. So it's a lot of pain condensed into a 4-minute period to not have to think about birth control for the next 5 years. So, you know, some people prefer to take a pill every day. Some people are cool with getting an implant. Some people are cool with using physical barriers like condoms, and to each their own. I think those are kind of a different league of their own. Everyone should be using condoms. But if you want to back up, whatever that looks like for you, for me, wasn't a big fan of the pill every day. But I was like, you know what, let's try this. Let's give this a shot. And while I was doing it, I was like, why am I doing this? But then since then, I've been like, this is okay. This is fine. So there you go. My 2 cents on the process of how they place an IUD, an intrauterine device. Basically, this little T-shaped piece of plastic that sits in the uterus. There are 2 types of IUDs. One is hormonal. The other is copper. The copper IUD does not have hormones. The hormonal one, you guessed it, does. Okay. One other thing, sorry. And another thing before I move on. For the hormonal IUDs, the hormone that is used is a synthetic form of progesterone. And I wanted to give a shout out there because we actually just recently, in a recent episode, talked about synthetic progestin on episode 56. It was a Black History Month episode, and we talked about Dr. Percy Julian, who developed a method for creating synthetic hormones, including synthetic progesterone or progestin, with soybeans. So it all comes together, you know. Not that you needed to know that for this episode, but if you're a subscriber and you're like, hey, that sounds familiar, that's why. Episode 56, we talked about it. So there we go. Shout out to Dr. Percy Julian for making the technique that allowed me to get an IUD. Shouts out. Appreciate ya. Mean it. But yeah, so the hormonal IUD it releases synthetic progesterone. It has this sort of like reservoir where the hormone will slowly release on like a timed control over time. The copper IUD does not have hormone release from it. Instead, it just has like a string of copper kind of wrapped around the T of the IUD. And you might be saying, well, how does this work for birth control? And that's a great question, because that's the next question, question number 2. How do IUDs work? Generally, the primary mechanism of action for IUDs is to prevent the process of fertilization. Fertilization being the process of the sperm, meeting an egg, getting into an egg, penetrating an egg. And then that egg, that fertilized egg, will then implant itself into the cushiony wall of the endometrium of the uterus, before then it divides and grows into an embryo and then into a fetus, the stages of development. But IUDs work by preventing that process of fertilization, so preventing the sperm from getting to the egg. And the primary mechanism by which they do that does depend on whether it's a hormonal IUD or a copper IUD. But either way, both of them sort of create this local inflammatory reaction within the uterus. And this produces cytokines, or like cell signals, inflammatory signals within the uterus. And one mechanism of inflammation is to create cells like macrophages that will essentially attack the sperm or engulf the sperm and prevent them from ever reaching the egg. Additional mechanisms kind of vary depending on the type of IUD, as I mentioned. So hormonal IUDs, as I said, they release synthetic progesterone on like kind of a timed basis. Like little by little, they'll release progesterone. And there are many different types of hormonal IUDs, like a couple of different brands, if you will. So if you've heard of like a Mirena or a Liletta, those are higher dose IUDs, meaning that they have 52 milligrams of levonorgestrel. Big words, and we're saying them. Do we have the capability to say them? Probably not, but we're going to say them anyway. Okay. So the Mirena and the Liletta have 52 milligrams of levonorgestrel. The Kyleena has 19.5 milligrams, so about half that, or less than half of what the Mirena and the Liletta have. And then the Skyla has 13.5 milligrams of levonorgestrel, which is the lowest dose one. Now, do I want to get into the specifics of it? Maybe I do. The releasing of the hormone does vary slightly between the different types of IUDs, where the higher dose, the 52 milligrams, have a slightly higher release rate of about 20 micrograms per day to start. But that kind of decreases over time, so that by 5 years into a high dose IUD, that release rate is about 14 micrograms per day. That's a difference of 1,000-fold. So 14 micrograms a day is the rate of release 5 years after getting a Mirena or a Liletta. So basically the rate drops about 10 micrograms per day after 5 years. But these IUDs, they recommend anywhere between 5 to 7 years generally. For the Kyleena, which is the 19.5 milligram levonorgestrel, that releases slightly lower than 20 micrograms of the Mirena and the Liletta. This one releases 17.5 micrograms per day. And then after 5 years, its average drops about to 9 micrograms a day. So after about 5 years, it drops about 7 or 8 micrograms per day. Kyleena is recommended for 5-year use. So once it gets to that 5 year, it's releasing about 9 micrograms of synthetic levonorgestrel a day, it may not be as effective at preventing pregnancy. So they recommend you change it after 5 years. And then Skyla, which is the lowest one, that's the 13.5 milligram one. And that one is good for 3 years. So it's the lowest dose, but it's also the shortest efficacy. So, after 3 years, you're going to have to go back and get another one. And let me tell you, after doing it the first time, I think I'm going to die with this thing inside me. There's no way I'm doing that again. So 3 years, not going to cut it. But I guess the mechanism of action that's specific to the hormonal IUDs, because they all kind of use the same synthetic hormone. It's just the dosing and the release rate that's a little different, but generally they all kind of work the same way, where the hormone levonorgestrel is releasing from the IUD, and it causes a local downstream effect that thickens the cervical mucus. So there's this like mucus that surrounds or, is on the outside of the cervix. And if this mucus is very thick, it's very challenging for the sperm to swim through that mucus. And that prevents the sperm from getting in to the uterus, getting to the fallopian tube, meeting an egg, fertilizing it. That whole process is prevented because of the thick cervical mucus that happens with hormonal IUDs. Sometimes in higher dose IUDs like the Mirena and the Loletta, not always, but about 20% of users found that their IUD suppressed their ovulation. So, like 1 in 5 people who have a Mirena will not ovulate, and then they will also, because they don't ovulate, they also won't have a period. So I guess maybe it would have been nice to have the figure here that kind of shows the ebb and flow of different hormones throughout the menstrual cycle. But in a normal menstrual cycle, progesterone, which is levonorgestrel, is a synthetic progesterone. Progesterone only increases after ovulation, but before ovulation, there are other hormones like estrogen, like luteinizing hormone, like follicle stimulating hormone that all kind of drive the preparation of the egg to release from the ovary. So when you have progesterone constantly being released by these IUDs, sometimes what can happen is it affects the balance of the other hormones, and that can prevent the egg from being released from the ovary, which is the process of ovulation. So in some cases, these IUDs will prevent ovulation. That's another mechanism actually to prevent pregnancy, is if there's no egg, there's no chance to fertilize an egg. So that's, I guess, an effective way to prevent pregnancy as well. As far as the efficacy, or when IUDs start to become efficacious after placing them, it usually takes hormonal IUDs 1 to 2 weeks, I think is the recommended timeline for it to actually take effect from a contraceptive standpoint. So to prevent a pregnancy, you should wait about 1 to 2 weeks after its placed before you rely on it for birth control. The other type of IUD is the copper IUD. And when I said before that the copper IUD is a string of copper wrapped around a plastic device, I'm not kidding. That's literally what it is. So that's what this looks like. There is one singular type of copper IUD. It's called Paragard. It is approved for use for 10 to 12 years, which is crazy. That one is, you're getting your bang for your buck, for a decade of effective birth control. That's, I'll get into why I didn't choose this one in a second, but from the science perspective. The copper IUD releases copper ions into the uterus, into the endometrial space, the endometrial cavity, if you will. And it also releases copper ions into the cervical mucus. These copper ions impair sperm migration, so it keeps the sperm from being able to reach the egg. It basically makes the sperm immobile, so they can't swim to find the egg, and they can't fertilize it. It can't implant into the uterine lining. It can't become a baby. So that is the main mechanism by which copper IUDs work. Like the other IUDs, it also does create like a local inflammatory reaction that will prevent the fertilization as well. Something different about the copper IUDs versus hormonal is that it can be used as an emergency contraceptive option if implanted like not too soon after unprotected sex. Or I should say not too long after unprotected sex, very soon after. It can be used as a form of emergency contraception because it can prevent the implantation of a fertilized egg into the endometrium. So it starts working immediately versus the hormonal IUDs, which need about 1 to 2 weeks to work properly. And as for why I did not choose this one, I might get into this in the next page. Maybe not, though. My doctor, I should say this. I should have prefaced this. I got an IUD after discussing this with my physician. So if you're considering types of birth control, don't come here. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm just talking science about how they work. But you should go to your doctor because they understand you a lot better. They understand your body. You understand your body. You can have that conversation with them. But one thing that my doctor warned me about a copper IUD is that oftentimes it makes your periods very heavy. And I'm not about that. I'm not a fan of that. So I said, you know what? I'm not going to do the copper. But some people prefer the copper because it's non-hormonal. So their hormones are unaffected by it all. They still ovulate. They still, have like a typical normal cycle. So they get the copper IUD to deal with that. I didn't really care as much about that. I just really didn't want a heavy period. So I was like, I'm going to get the hormonal IUD because sometimes, with high dose IUDs, you lose your period altogether. I actually got the Kyleena, which is the 5-year one. But even that, they were like, oh, your periods might be lighter on the hormonal IUD versus a copper. And I was like, okay, sold. Give me 12 of them. Just kidding. Again, I'm not getting another one of these. I survived it once. I don't think I could survive it again. But yeah, that's essentially how it works. It's a local inflammatory reaction for both types. For hormonal IUDs, it really relies on thickening the cervical mucus to prevent the sperm from getting through. For copper IUDs, it releases copper ions that render sperm immobile, so they cannot move to the egg in order to complete the fertilization process. So that's how they work. Now you know. And now we'll move on to the third question, which is how well does it work? Both hormonal and copper IUDs are over 99% effective at preventing pregnancy. From my understanding, they are one of the most, if not the most, well, I guess not the most, but one of the most effective forms of contraception. So, and that is, of course, when they're used appropriately. So a couple of things to keep in mind for appropriate use. One is the duration and making sure that if you have, for example, the Mirena IUD that's recommended for 5 to 7 years, that you're not keeping that thing in there for 8, 9, 10 years. As soon as it's ready to be replaced or to be taken out, you should do so in order to make sure that it is as effective as it can be. Same thing for the lower dose ones. So like the Kyleena is 5 years, Skyla is 3 years, making sure that you're not kind of going past the recommended duration for those hormonal IUDs. Another thing to note is that placement of the IUD also matters, and it also contributes to the efficacy, where if the IUD is knocked out of place, for example, in some cases, and this was another thing that my doctor had me sign off on, was that sometimes the IUD can perforate the uterus and it can kind of poke through your uterus. And if it does that, then it's not as effective. So when you get your IUD placed, your doctor will like do an ultrasound to make sure that it's where it's supposed to be. But yeah, so those are things to keep in mind in terms of efficacy. I have this image source here. It was not from the textbook, so there is a little bit of discrepancy from what was cited in the textbook in terms of duration for some of these. Like the IUD, it says for Paragard is 12 years. I guess up to 12 years is true, but Mirena, it says up to 5 years. But the textbook said Mirena could be up to 7 years, so maybe talk to your doctor about that if you're considering that. But it kind of shows the comparison of IUDs to other forms of birth control and how well they work. So on like the 5-star, works really, really well. Both copper and hormonal IUDs are on this level alongside the Nexplanon implant, which is also synthetic progesterone, I believe. It's definitely hormonal. And it like releases, but it's implanted into your arm. So it's a little bit more of like a systemic delivery of the hormone versus the IUDs, which are of course local to the uterus generally. Also in a works really, really well category is sterilization for both men and women. So vasectomies for men, or, you know, getting a tubal ligation for women. What works okay, and sorry, I should say for it works really, really well, the chance of getting pregnant on that tier with the implant, the IUD, or sterilization, less than 1 in 100 women who use that type of birth control will get pregnant. For the middle tier, which is it works okay, that includes the patch, the birth control pill, the Depo-Provera shot, and the ring, the NuvaRing. In these, they still work pretty well, but in these types, anywhere between 6 and 9 in 100 women will get pregnant using these methods. So it's not over 99% like the IUDs are. And then the lowest tier, which is works not as well, includes fertility tracking, fertility awareness, using a diaphragm, the pull-out method, condoms are all on this like lowest tier. And for these methods, anywhere between 12 to 24 out of 100 women using these methods can get pregnant. Without birth control at all, so like the baseline minimum, over 90 in 100 young women would get pregnant in a year. So the not as well tier is better than nothing, but it certainly is not the most effective. And also a nice call out here for condoms needed for STD protection, and you can use them with any other method as just backup protection. So we are promoting safe sex practices. Oh, I guess just one other thing that I didn't really mention as I was going through the tiers, but important to note, for the really, really well tier, the frequency with which you have to take this form of birth control is on the scale of years, right? 3 years for the implant, anywhere from 3 to 12 years, depending on the type of IUD you get. Sterilization is usually permanent. So, or I guess vasectomies can be reversible, but they can also be permanent. So that's really like a once in a couple years or forever that you have to worry about it. For the okay tier, things like the pill you have to take every day, the patch every week, the ring every month, the Depo-Provera shot every 3 months. For the not as well tier, so like fertility awareness, using a diaphragm, the pull-out method, or condoms, those are things you either have to track every day, like your fertility, or like every time you have sex, you have to, you know, put in the diaphragm or whatever. Like that's something you have to worry about every time, versus, you know, on the scale of days to weeks in the middle tier, or years in the really, really well, highly efficacious birth control tier. So this is all to say, IUDs work very well at preventing pregnancy. Less than 1 in 100 women will get pregnant if they have an IUD in. That's what we love to hear. Another thing that I wanted to note is that in addition to being very efficacious, both hormonal and copper IUDs are generally really well tolerated and well recommended by physicians. So generally, there are certain cases where an IUD wouldn't be recommended. Like, for example, if you have a distorted uterine cavity, if you have an endometrial cancer, for hormonal IUDs, breast cancers can be sort of like a contraindicator where if you have a breast cancer, hormonal IUDs may not be recommended. But I think that the copper IUDs are generally good to go if you have a breast cancer, just because they're not hormonal. But generally, the IUDs are very well tolerated and recommended for safe use. So that's another thing to consider. I think that was something that I was considering too, of like, when I was deciding to get like what form of birth control to get an IUD, understanding that like, although the process to get it is not pleasant, once you have it, like you're good. And it's not really going to be contraindicated for other certain conditions or diseases or whatnot. So just a note there that it does generally, they are safe and well recommended, regardless of certain types of conditions, with a couple of exceptions that I mentioned. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this episode. The takeaways for today's episode: pros and cons of an IUD, set it and forget it. But that shit hurted. And that I'm not going to forget. I'm not going to forget that it hurt. Let me tell you right now. I already told you. Don't make me say it again. Relive it. The flashbacks. But yes, IUDs are intrauterine devices that are highly effective forms of birth control. Copper IUDs work by releasing copper ions into the cervical mucus and the endometrial cavity, and those prevent sperm from getting to the egg to complete the fertilization process. Hormonal IUDs create local changes to the cervical environment to prevent sperm from getting through to the uterus as well, by thickening that cervical mucus. And regardless of type of IUD, copper or hormonal, both are very effective at preventing pregnancy. Again, less than 1 in 100 women with an IUD will get pregnant, as long as they're used for a proper duration and they have a proper placement. That's all for this week's episode. Please don't forget to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you're listening, and subscribe on YouTube, please. You can follow the show on social medias. My handle is at samsplainingsci. So you can connect with me there and ask questions if you'd like. You can also, this is the third time I'm plugging this today, but I'm going to do it again. You can ask a question at samsplainingscience.com/ask. So if you have anything that you want samsplained to you, ask away. Thank you very much for listening or watching to this week's episode. I hope you learned a little bit. I hope you laughed a little bit. I hope you weren't traumatized by my IUD story. And I will talk to you next time. Bye.